Habla español. I'll tell you in Spanish.
That was in the 50s.
Hi, I brought show and tell.
You did? Oh, okay, why don't you start, and then I got a lot to get.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's hard to believe today's our last day for this school year. I brought some show and tell. We were talking about the Berlin Wall, and I told you my son was there, and you can come look at it after the class. And here it is. So I give you to our rabbi, and I absolutely want to say thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful year.
You are very welcome, very welcome. So today I want to cover Hungary, and we have a lot to go through today in Hungary. So I'm going to move quickly through it, and I would ask that we try to keep comments and questions sort of at a minimum, unless, you know, so that I can get through this, because there's a lot to cover with Hungary. Okay, so before 1095, before 1095, and in your heads you're thinking 1095, around 1100. What's going on in the world for Jews in 1100? First Crusade, exactly. Okay? So I'm just, as we go through this class, I want to keep trying to point out so that we all have sort of an idea, okay, what's going on in the world for Jews at this time? Around the First Crusade, just before, King Decebalus allows Jews to settle in the area that we now know as Hungary, and they had been there from an earlier time. He allows them now to come in and settle. And this was in the very early years, like 87 to 100 CE, very, very early on. We know that Jews are there for sure by 960 CE. And we know that because there was a letter written to King Joseph by a Spanish Jew who was a statesman in Cordoba. His name was Hasdai ibn Shaprut. And he mentions in this letter, and it's a letter to the Khazars, and we're going to talk about that in a second, to the Khazars, and they mention the Jews of Hungarian, quote, the Jews of Hungarian, unquote. So we know there are Jews living in the area that we now know as Hungary is 960. Okay, I want to take a 5-minute excursus to the Khazars, because it's so important in our tradition. The Khazars was a kingdom, and in what is present-day Azerbaijan, in the bottom right of the map there. And they existed from around 650 to about 969 CE, of course. And in the 8th century, so in the 700s, they convert to Judaism. It's a very small group, a group of Turkish origin, and they convert to Judaism in the 8th century. Now, the reason why this is important for us is because there's a very, very famous Jewish book about this, and it's called the Kuzari. Has anyone ever heard this before? Okay, the Kuzari. The Kuzari was written by Judah Halevi, who was a Spanish philosopher and poet. He wrote this in Arabic because at the time there were large portions of Spain that were ruled by the Moors, right? The Reconquista of Spain doesn't happen until 1492, the final Reconquista, meaning the reconquest of Spain by Christianity doesn't happen until 1492. That's the end of it. It had started earlier. And so what does the Kuzari talk about? The Kuzari is an imaginary discussion with the king of the Khazars, who has asked the question, what is the real religion? What is the true religion? And so in this book, there are 4 individuals who come before the king and try to explain the religion. The first is a philosopher, then a Christian, then a Muslim, and then a Jew. And ultimately, the Jew convinces the king that they should convert. What's really important about this work for us has to do with the idea of being the chosen people. Because Halevi in this book talks about the uniqueness of the Jewish people. And he unabashedly makes the case that the Jewish people are superior to all other peoples on the planet. Okay, so we have to take a breath and understand that. Basically, the idea is that Jews have superior DNA. And so when we get to the idea of the chosen people, and if we're intellectually honest, we have to understand that is what the text says. That's what the text says. God says in 2 places. One is conditional, one is unconditional. If you obey all my commandments, then you will be my most treasured people. Most treasured people, like above everybody else. The other one just says, you are my treasured people. And the consensus, of course, of the rabbis is, in order to be a treasured people, we have to do our part, which means we have to be good people on this earth, and that allows us to qualify as God's chosen people. And of course, over the years, it's become a big problem for Jews, a big problem, because we don't want to think of ourselves as better than anyone else. And so the rabbis do all kinds of things and commentary to try to work around this a little bit. Chosen for a special mission. This was the Reform position for a long time. Every group of peoples is chosen for something. The Jews were chosen to spread the ethical commandments and monotheism. Okay, the Greeks were chosen to spread philosophy and science. The so and so. Okay. Anyway, it's caused a huge problem, and it's a very difficult theological problem for us to deal with, because we were killed, murdered, persecuted mightily in the Middle Ages by Christians who saw themselves as the new Israel, the new chosen people. Okay, so this is called the Kuzari, and it's written about the Khazars' kingdom, Khazar, Khazar, Khazar kingdom, in what is present-day Azerbaijan. The kingdom no longer exists. Khazars no longer exist. Okay. In 1061, King Bela says that the markets must stay open on Saturdays. In 1077, laws come down that say the Jews can't have Christians' wives or slaves. And that had been in effect already in Christian Europe since the 5th century. But it gets introduced into Hungary, and at the time there were no rabbis, but the Jewish population there was very observant. Starting around 1100, we have the next leader, Coleman, and he restricted Jews to cities that were run by the church. So the Jews had to be under a watchful eye and had to be managed. Of course, then we have the Crusades. And during the Crusades, as we already talked about, Jews persecuted, executed, many committed suicide, Al-Kiddush Hashem. And the victims of the Crusades, those who were displaced by the Crusades in Bohemia, immigrated to Hungary. And that led to new rules, because you had lots of Jewish immigrants, new rules regarding lending, because the rulers wanted to limit how much power the Jews could have and how much they could benefit from things in society. So they said, now you have to have two witnesses when in the course of a loan. Why? Well, Jews were perceived as being tricky and dishonest, and so you had to make sure that there were witnesses so that nobody could claim something false. In 1200, King Andrew II, who had Jewish officials, farmed the royal revenues to the Jews, and he ended up being excommunicated by Pope Honorarium III. Then Pope Gregory IX comes on and completely reverses things. He requires badges for Jews and a continued policy of not being able to buy or keep Christian slaves. Isn't this interesting that at this time in this region, so much talk, we encountered this in a number of other countries too, so much talk about not keeping Christian slaves. What does that tell us? That tells us that keeping Christian slaves was a thing. I mean, it was a thing. And so, as we talked about last week, I think, Christians as slaves, when Jews were kept as slaves, they were kept under the guise of being indentured servants. So, if a Jew needed to pay off a debt to another Jew, he or she could become a slave, an indentured servant of the Jew for a specified period of time, after which the debt was paid off, worked off. And we have that biblically as well. Starting in 1349, so 1349 should go ding, 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 ding. 1349 is the Black Death. 1349 is the bubonic plague. So starting in 1349, we have many persecutions of Jews. Because of the Black Death, Jews in the area that we're calling Hungary right now were expelled. Then they were readmitted, and then they were expelled again in 1360. As we go through the history of Hungary, we're going to find good, terrible, good, terrible, good, terrible, good, terrible. The poor Jews of Hungary, they went through craziness. They had good periods, and then it was terrible. And then they had good periods, then it was terrible. Okay. Sure. Good question. Gary wants to know, why were they readmitted if they were expelled again? They were expelled after the king tried to make them all convert, and they wouldn't convert. However, the government fell into financial distress. So whom did they call to rescue them? They let the Jews back in because they needed the trade, they needed the expertise of the Jews with weights and measures, and they needed to get more money coming in. In 1526, the Ottomans defeat the Hungarians. And in 1529, we have the first case of blood libel there. And remember, blood libel is the Christian community accuses a Jew or Jews of killing a Christian child just before Passover, and using its blood to make matzah for Passover. And this definitely was a thing in Christian Europe. And in this particular case, in 1529, the person they accused was burned at the stake, and the Jews were expelled from the city of, if you look in the top left, Trnava, in what is now Slovakia. But generally speaking, once the Ottomans take over, remember how we talked for a long time in class about the different ways that Jews were treated by Christians as opposed to Muslims. So the Jews, once the Ottomans take over, the Jews were treated better. Up until now, we had persecutions, expulsions, executions. Now the Ottomans take over, and Jews are simply dhimmis again, Dhimmis, basically second-class citizens, but allowed to practice Judaism as long as we did it quietly and we didn't make a show of anything, we didn't create any problems. We were very respectful to Muslims. We could coexist and not be killed and persecuted. I should point out that, nothing is absolute. Persecutions did take place under Islam for Jews, but it was so much less than it was under Christianity. Here and there, things happened. History is never clean and never perfect. It's always very messy, and here and there stuff happened. But in general, we can say the Jewish population lived more easily under Islam than it did under Christianity. In 1686, the Habsburg dynasty recaptures Hungary from the Ottomans. And of course, you can imagine, now that the Jews are not living under Islam anymore, they're living under Christianity of the Habsburg Empire, things got much worse. And that is in fact the case. The rule was put out immediately that Jews could be exterminated at will. And they needed to be weeded out of the general population. So what did they do? They doubled the taxation for Jews. They said no Jews could be involved in any agricultural pursuits. They can't own real estate. And again, they can't own any Christian servants. I guess this was a big thing, and it really bothered everybody that Jews would have Christian servants, because it appears all over the place. And obviously, you don't make a rule against something that's not happening. So if there's a rule against it, it was clearly happening. And I guess that was so offensive to Christian rulers that they would have to be serving Jews. That was a very big deal, and they made sure that that was not okay. Yes. So the question is, were the Jews supportive of the Ottomans, and is that why they were targeted? They were targeted more for their religious beliefs and the Christian notion that we were killers of Jesus, and that Christianity had replaced Judaism as God's favored religion. You'll recall, and you know what? We're doing way better on time than I thought, so I can slow down just slightly, and we can ask questions. Great. I was just really worried we weren't going to get through this. Okay, and I took off like a bat out of you-know-what, and anyway, hang on one sec, so let me just go with this. Um, um, oh, yes. So remember that Christianity saw itself, as we talked about, as the new Israel. What does that mean? It means that for Christians, up until modern times, the agreement, the testament that God made with humans through Jesus replaced the covenant that God made with Moses at Mount Sinai. In other words, we moved through time, and God says, okay, now I want something different from human beings. And what I want now is that everybody understands that Jesus was sent to the earth to atone for human sin. And according to Christians, that's what God wants now. And our covenant on Mount Sinai with Moses was old, it was replaced, it was changed. All right. Obviously, for Jews, we did not agree to that, and for that reason, which is why we just wouldn't convert. Everybody wanted to convert us, and everybody thought once we saw the wisdom and the wonderfulness of this New Testament, we were just going to line up and convert. And of course, we said, oh, no, no, thank you. Thanks for asking, but we're not interested. And that enraged the Christians. It enraged them. And that was not removed until 1965. 1965, the Pope rescinds, the Vatican rescinds the idea that the Christian covenant replaces the Jewish covenant and that Jews killed Jesus. And they affirmed that the Christian covenant is for everybody except Jews. They have their covenant, and that remains in force for them. Now, what this leads to in modern times is a very stark difference theologically, and I bet you didn't even know this, theologically between the three movements, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. And that's the idea of revelation. What separates the movements, along with whether they consider halakha mandatory or voluntary, is the idea of revelation. So for Orthodoxy, they believe in what we call static revelation. Static revelation is, it happened one time on Mount Sinai. Moses got everything from God at that moment in history, and it has not changed through history. And this was codified in the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of law written around 1500 by Joseph Caro, in which an Orthodox Jew can say, what is the Jewish law regarding such and such? And you open the Shulchan Aruch, and it tells you, this is what you have to do. As we talked about last week, then the Reform takes the other position. The Reform takes the position of what we call progressive revelation. Progressive revelation means, for us, for Jews, God's will gets more authoritative the later in history that we go. Not the earlier in history, like the Orthodoxy, the later in history that we go. So God still has our covenant, but there are some slight modifications to it from when Moses got it to where we are now in 2023. That we have to live in a modern society, and that God's will for us in 2023 is slightly different than it was for us in biblical times. Of course, and then we have the conservative position, which we call continuous revelation, which is that over time, God is constantly reaffirming the covenant, but allowing for incremental changes here and there. So, for instance, the ability of women to come up to the Torah, the ability of women to be counted in the minyan, the ability to drive to and from synagogue, these kinds of things, because the conservative movement said, look, we're in Detroit in February. We're not walking to synagogue. It's minus 12 outside, and there's a snowstorm. People aren't walking to synagogue. It's dangerous. So what's the greater mitzvah? That they get to synagogue and pray, or that they walk? Yes, Joette? Sure. That's correct too. Yes, Joette says she thought the reason for the accommodation of driving to and from synagogue was more an advent from the great move in the 1950s to the suburbs, where your synagogue, if you were living in New York, you could walk down the street, take a right, and there was your little synagogue that you prayed at, your little shtibel where you prayed at. When you moved to the suburbs, your synagogue might be 15 minutes away. Might be a very long way, too long to walk. 15 minutes by car, meaning. And so it might be too long to walk. So that is absolutely 100% a reason. I used Detroit in the middle of winter because it was like, okay, this is a... We came from Russia and Poland where it was just as cold in the middle of winter. Yes. And the missing part of what I had said was what Joette filled in, is that it could be a very long way from where you are to where you are going to pray, and the accommodation was made to drive. Okay. And when the Torah was written, it was in the Middle East, and there was no cold and stove, and there were no synagogues. Right? There was no synagogues. There was a temple. There was a Mishkan. And everybody lived and had to make a pilgrimage when we get to the great temple. Yes, Ken? The Kuzari is available on Amazon if anyone would like to. In Kindle or in writing. Yes. Very nice. Thank you. Okay. So, let's see. Where was I? So the Habsburg dynasty recaptures Hungary, and Jews, the order goes out that Jews could be expelled and weeded out. There was double taxation, no agriculture, they can't own real estate or Christian servants. The Kuzari inhabited Hungary? No. The only reason I brought up the Kuzari is because the letter written to the king of the Khazars mentioned the phrase Jews of Hungarian. And then it's like, you know what? I should take a little excursus for 2 seconds and talk about the Khazars, because they're a very interesting case. And obviously I didn't do Jews in Azerbaijan, so I just thought I'd slip that in there. Not so many. Not so many. Zisel. That is correct. So Zisel says the Ottomans were easier on Jews because they called them the people of the book. Remember that when Muhammad, when we go back, when Muhammad has his revelation, he understands that the Jews and Christians already had a written tradition. Pagans didn't have a written tradition. We already had our written tradition of the Torah, the Bible, and Christians had their tradition of what they call the New Testament. And for Muhammad, we were the closest thing to monotheism that resembled his idea of monotheism. So he said, look, the Jews are okay. They're monotheists, they're not pagans for sure, and they already have a written tradition. So look, they're not Muslims, which isn't great, but at least they're monotheists and they have their written tradition, so they're the people of the book. We have our own book, the Torah and the Bible. And so Muhammad said, we'll basically leave them alone. That's right. So Zisel also says, as Islam spreads throughout the ancient world, people were told, convert or die. The Jews didn't have to, because we already had our tradition, and Muhammad respected it. He respected it until, as we talked about very quickly, he respected it until he went to the Jewish elders and said, look, I have this new religion. It's called Islam, and here are some things about it. And he talked about some of our Bible stories and some of our tradition, and the elders, obviously with changes so that they would be favorable to Islam, and the Jewish elders said, no, that's not the story. You change this to this, and this is not the story. And Muhammad was, well, this is how it was revealed to me. This is the story. No, this is not the story. This is the story. And then Muhammad got very anti-Jewish, and we know the result of that. Lots of problems since then. Lots of problems. So in 1690, after there was double taxation, no agriculture, can't own real estate, can't have Christian servants, the Jews are expelled again. And there is widespread persecution. And then things improve again about 2 decades later, in 1711, under Charles III. He tried to limit Jews who were coming into the territory, but many Jews were coming into the territory because it was now favorable for Jews. In 1740 and around 1735, 1740, there were 11,621, I don't know how they got so precise, but they did apparently. 11,621. I don't know who that 21st Jew was. 21 Jews in Hungary at the time. 35% of them were ethnic Hungarian, and the rest were immigrants coming from various countries around Hungary, including Germany. Many Germans, because remember, Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany was right next to that. Under Queen Maria Theresa in 1740, guess what? The Jews are expelled. Surprise, surprise, they're expelled. These poor Jews, I mean, they leave, they come back, they leave, they come back, they leave, they come back. We make light of it, but it must have been horrific. And wherever Jews were found, they had to pay a toleration tax. And what was a toleration tax? Yup. Yup. Eileen says, we'll tolerate you if you pay. And that's exactly it. You're like, what? If you pay us, we'll tolerate you being here. Yes, Janice. And wear special clothes so we know who you are. Very good. Now, in 1780, guess what? No, they came back and they were treated much better. They were treated much better by Joseph II, who was Maria Theresa's son. He allowed them to return to towns. Business and education rules were relaxed, so Jews could be involved in business ventures. They could open schools. So much so that in 1783, the Jewish communities write a letter expressing gratitude to Joseph II. So you can imagine each of these times when there's prosperity, Jews come in, and then they're kicked out, and then they come back in, and then they okay. Well, once Joseph II dies, then we have hostility again. There's a Rosa king who knew not Joseph. Very, very clever. Good, Joette. Very good. There arose a king who knew not Joseph, right? That's how the book of begins. Exodus begins. Very good. Very good. Okay. So then we had a period of hostility, followed by a period of when it was very good again. Under Leopold, they had much better treatment, and the Jewish population grew by 80% between 1815 and 1840. 1848 to 1849 is the beginning of the Hungarian Revolution for independence, and many Jews fought in the Hungarian Revolution. On July 28th, 1849, Jews get full citizenship. That's wonderful. Guess how long it lasted? 5 minutes, a year, 10 years, 50 years, 2 weeks. Woo! It lasted 2 weeks. They got citizenship for 2 weeks. They got citizenship for 2 weeks because Austria was trying to quell this rebellion of Hungary, moving away from it. Remember, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now Hungary wanted to be just Hungary. They didn't want to be part of the linked with Austria. So Austria comes in to try to quell the rebellion, and Russia comes in from the other side to try to help them. And when that happens, many Jews are imprisoned and executed, and they had to pay a heavy war tax because they were being punished for having participated in this rebellion. Okay. Now, the Habsburgs come in, and they are able to subdue the rebellion, and Hungary remains part of the Habsburg Empire. And under the Habsburgs, things are improved for Jews. They're allowed to open some schools. In fact, on October 4th, 1877, the Budapest University of Jewish Studies opens, which to this day is the premier college, Jewish college in Hungary. The Budapest University of Jewish Studies. And in 1890, of the Jews of Hungary, 64% were Hungarian Jews. So whereas before it was mostly immigrants, now 64% are Hungarian Jews, 33% are German Jews, and 2% are from the various neighboring countries. So some total populations of Jews. In 1890, there were 707,000 Jews in Hungary. That's a lot. In 1900, there were 831,000. In 1910, just before World War I, 911,000. And in 1941, at the start of World War II, there were 846,000. So, very large Jewish community. The largest Jewish community in that area. Certainly Poland was far more, but in the area of Hungary, the largest Jewish population. During World War I, 10,000 Jews, 10,000 Hungarian Jews either died or were wounded. In 1938 to 1941, you can imagine these, we already have been, you've got the Nuremberg laws in Germany, and you've got laws all throughout Europe now. There were anti-Jewish laws passed between 1938 and 1941 that restricted Jews in many professions, including being doctors and lawyers. It established your being Jewish if you had 2, 3, or 4 Jewish-born grandparents. So if you had at least 2 Jewish grandparents, you were Jewish. And you could not marry or have sex with a non-Jew. So apparently, in order to qualify, you had to have minimum two Jewish grandparents. So if someone only had one Jewish grandparent, then they weren't technically considered Jewish. So that's a good question. I would say, and I would answer it this way. Halakhically, the person's Jewish. Probably for the government, they weren't. Correct. Correct. Ziesel says under Hitler, it was if you had one Jewish grandparent. Yes. So in 1944, Hitler invades Hungary. And almost all the Jews of Hungary are deported to Auschwitz. 44. They were the last ones to go, yeah. And they were decimated in Auschwitz. Out of 800 and, what did I say? There were 119,000 survivors, which was 29% of the entire Jewish population of Hungary. At the end of World War II, there were only 14,000 Jews who were living in Hungary. And between 45 and 49, many, many Jews emigrated to Israel. Yes? Oh my goodness. So Ray is telling us that this was someone in your family? First cousin who escaped from the Germans, and then he went to Hungary and he was knocking on doors and he found a widow who would take him in, and she gave him her husband, her late husband's identity in order to save him. So the lady who took him in, her family was very virulently anti-Semitic, but they were afraid to turn him in because they thought that there would be repercussions for her, their daughter, who took him in. And so he became very famous after the war, and they moved to Hamburg to get away. Oh, very nice. What was his fame in designing clothes? What did you say his fame was in designing clothes? Or what did you say? He became famous for what? Yeah, women's clothing. Yeah. Very nice. Okay. Presently in Hungary, there are about 80,000 Jews. So it's a nice population. Most of them live in Budapest. There are 20 synagogues and many other Jewish institutions. So it's a thriving Jewish community in Hungary. Most of the Jews who live in the western part of the country, because it's closer to Germany, speak German. Most of the Jews who live in the eastern part of the country, because it's closer to Galicia and the Eastern European nations, speak Yiddish, or spoke Yiddish at least. There are three movements within Hungarian Jewry. There's Orthodoxy, we know what that is. Then there's something called Neolog, Neolog, Neolog Judaism, which is progressive Judaism. And the most that I could tell about it is it kinda like Reform, sorta. And then they have something called status quo Judaism. And status quo is very, very, very small movement. And all that it says about it is that it doesn't adhere to either Orthodoxy or Neolog. It's sort of like out there on its own. So maybe it's, I don't know how we would, maybe it's like Jewish renewal here, something like that. Jewish renewal is a very beautiful, beautiful movement within Judaism. It's a small movement, and it's very progressive, very, very progressive, and non-traditional. They have beautiful ceremonies and singing. It's lovely. By far, Neolog, which is the sort of, kind of, maybe Reform Judaism in Hungary, is by far the largest movement in Hungary. Interesting fact, 60% of Hungarian Nobel laureates were Jewish. 60%. No, we're not surprised at all. We're proud. Many of the Hungarian Jewish families have short German family names. They're very popular because so many of them trace their ancestry back to German immigrants into Hungary. Chabad established itself in Hungary in 1989, and they're all over the place. There are many Israelis who live in Hungary. Kosher food is readily available everywhere. They have many youth organizations. And as I said, Budapest University of Jewish Studies is the premier upper-level education establishment within Hungary. 1048. I'd say that was pretty great. Pretty great. All right, everybody, this has been truly wonderful. I love I love actually learning from all of you because you all have great education as well as experiences in all these various places that adds to everything. So I will very much look forward to starting again when we start again. And I am off to Chicago in 3 weeks for 1 month to take the last class that I need to finish up the coursework for my doctorate. Then I have comprehensive exams for about 4 to 6 months, and then dissertation for about a year. And then, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's way back, it's way back there behind Susie somewhere. But there is a light. Where in Chicago? It's on Michigan Avenue. Spertus Institute on Michigan Avenue. Spertus is one of the top Jewish colleges in the United States.
So, Rabbi, we want to thank you again for a wonderful year of learning, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall. And Susie mentioned to me that we may start as early as October 10th again, and we'll get you the information. We'll continue this series because we're only on Hungary, and there are many more countries left, so we'll just continue. And we may even continue till the following year. It depends.
Yeah, we'll have to see. There's so much to talk about.
I know there is a lot, and
It's interesting stuff.
right.
No, Budapest is the capital.
But there are two parts of Budapest, separated by the Danube. Buda and Pest. There's a river, which river is it? Anyway, thank you all for a wonderful class. Okay, break time. Understanding that. So maybe. Okay, thank you. Hello. Hi. Hi. Right this second. On the other. Right. Let's talk for a moment. Okay. Morning, everybody. Buongiorno, buongiorno. It was a nice trip. Thank you. Let me get a mic. Good morning, everybody far away. Good morning, everybody nearby. We are at our last class today. I'm sure that you had a fascinating time over the last couple of weeks. I look forward to hearing about what that fascinating time was. But today we're going to conclude our journey through 1800s and early 1900s Jewish California. And we're going to start it today after we say our blessing with learning together a little bit from some articles that I've gleaned for us about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, and specifically responses by people in the Jewish community and some information about what happened to the Jewish community that we've already been discussing over all this period of time. If we have any time left over, I'd like to take you into a brief, I don't know whether we will, because I never time how these things work, but if we do have time left over, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of the women who made California Jewry and California function. And there are three particular women that if we have time, I would love to make sure that you hear about. So that's why we have a screen up here, because if we're able to do that, I'd like to broadcast their pictures for you, but I don't know whether we're going to be able to get there or not. But we'll be together next year, so we'll find another topic to discuss. So I'd like to distribute to you after we say the blessing. So let's say the blessing first. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
I think it's absolutely wonderful how you have spent your MID year immersing yourself in the words of Torah, because everything that we learn together in any one of our classes with any one of our instructors, it's all Torah. It helps us to understand who we are and some of the values that we hold. So we'll learn a little bit of that today. I'm going to distribute to you first an article that came from a book called California, Earthquakes and Jews, about what happened to Jewish institutions on that fateful day in April in 1906. So if somebody wants to help me to distribute this, that would be great. I will go. Oh, sorry. You know him. Actually, I have one more copy, Gary, if somebody... people will have to share. People will have to share. So if you are in a zug, in a couple, please share. And I have one more copy here. And I think what I'm going to do is let's see here. Rosalie, would you mind passing these out as well? No, would you mind? This is a different document. Okay. Split it up with your beloved. We're going to start with the one that Rosalie is passing out now. So set down this one that I've just given you. I thought that we should start with a reflection, that has a little bit of positivity to it. Don't read it ahead of time. People listen to me so well. Don't read it ahead of time. I think I have to go back to teaching Christian clergy who always listen to you when you tell them to, whatever you tell them to do, they absolutely listen. Jews, we're a little bit, okay. So the first document that hopefully some of you have, did not get it in the middle yet? Okay. We don't have any up at front. Okay. Yeah, the single thing we have. So this is called, please turn to your document that says Cyril Magnin said about 1906. Do you see that one? Okay. So who is Cyril Magnin? Yeah, department stores. So there was I. Magnins and Joseph Magnins, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about that today as well. But it is Cyril Magnin's view about what happened that day. And just so that you know, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, who served this community for, almost an entire lifetime at Temple Emmanuel, is Cyril's cousin. So, I'm going to read, Wilshire Boulevard Temple. I confused myself between San Francisco's big Reform congregation, Temple Emmanuel, and Los Angeles's big congregation. So here we go. And then somebody get ready to come up to the mic to read part of that as well. Come on up. Plaster started coming down on me, Cyril Magnin recalls of his awakening to the earthquake, and I had the brains enough to get up and get under the bed. It seemed like it lasted forever, but it wasn't that long. Magnin, retired merchandiser, bon vivant, and the city's chief of protocol, was born July 6, 1899. His father, Joseph, who would later found the specialty clothing store Joseph Magnin, was born in England. His mother, the former Charlotte Davis, was a native San Franciscan. Your turn.
Magnin, an only child, and his parents and a maid lived in the middle flat of a three-flat building at 1235 Masonic Avenue. I was by there one day not so long ago, and it is still there, he said in his sunny downtown office. When you feel that shaking, you never forget it. There are things that happened to me in the 1920s and 30s that I don't remember as well as that. Another vivid memory is of a little cart he had received for his birthday, which we used to haul water from pipes in Golden Gate Park. The Magnins were able to continue living in their flat, but we cooked in the street for a couple of weeks as we had no water.
I'll continue now. After the earthquake stopped, Magnin says, we went out into the street and saw a lot of pieces of buildings, but none had been completely destroyed. My father was so excited. He was in business with his mother, Mary Ann, Mrs. Isaac Magnin, I. Magnin, and he wanted to go downtown. His mother said no, but he went anyway. The I. Magnin store was destroyed.
My grandmother was a very bright woman, and I remember her coming to the house 3 or 4 days after the earthquake and saying, Joseph, you're going to New York and buy clothes to stock a store, which they would operate in the grandparents' house at Page and Masonic. They'll have a lot of money from insurance, Magnin remembers his grandmother telling his father. We'll do a big business, and they did.
Okay, so thank you. The reason that I wanted you to take a look at Cyril Magnin's memories first is in order to be able to see what some of the reactions were here. Now, Mary, who is the person who really ran and created Isaac Magnin's store, she had a really great head for business. So what does she say at the end of her son's or her cousin's recollection? Yeah. Okay, we've got this situation. Let's make something good out of it. So one of the things, I mean, it sounds a little mercenary, I think, and she was a very tough cookie of a woman, but one of the things that becomes clear in the Jewish community after the San Francisco earthquake is that the Jewish community has a much more upbeat, let's look to the future type of response than many other parts of the community had. And we're going to see that in the next article, which is more not statistical, but it tells us what's going on with all the different Jewish organizations in the city. But we will see a common theme. And the common theme is, let's get busy. We got to fix this. Now, why do you think that's the response that we saw in this brief Magnin piece, and that we'll see when we read the other one? 1, 2.
Jewish people have been through so many calamities and have had to move to other places. And when they moved, very often they flourished. So they're used to it.
Okay.
Well, since they were the minority and they had very little resources and there was no help around, they had to do it for themselves, and they had to stick together.
These are great additions to this discussion. So we've all been in an earthquake, right? How many people lived here in the 90s? And the 70s? Well, I'm trying to make it like, if you didn't live here in the 90s, then you didn't experience that earthquake, the Northridge earthquake, and then the 70s as well. 70s, 90s? I'll repeat what you say. Oh, the 50s. Okay, so one of the things we all know is that we kind of rock and roll our way through it and then figure out what to do next. I don't know if people have memories of what you did right after the whatever that earthquake is in Los Angeles that you were a part of, but we have a different story here in 1906. First of all, let's talk about what the different story is before we get to that. We had an earthquake in San Francisco, and then what did we have? A fire. We had a huge fire, and really the fire did much more damage, along with, the destruction of the buildings, the fire, but along with fire came the use of, they tried to use water, but all the pipes in the city had broken. So it was almost impossible to get water. So we're not talking about a end of 20th century, beginning of 21st century thing where the buildings are all built to be seismically safe, or where we have different gas pipes that are supposedly not supposed to catch fire like this. They had none of these. So let's go into the article, if it's okay with you. I would love to have a couple people come up here and just take turns reading. So if you are one of those people, come up and stand close to this mic, and it can be more than one person. I'm going to start with the introduction about who wrote this, Randolph Coffey, and that because our people at home don't have these documents, and then we'll just take turns after that.
Sorry about your.
No? Right. Oh, that's true. Gary said a lot of the buildings in LA are not retrofitted. Rehab, I'm doing Rabbi Rudolph. And then you can just decide and split up. Rabbi Rudolph I. Coffey, who wrote this article that we are now going to read, had been born in Oakland, California in 1878 and had been ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, that's the conservative movement seminary, in 1904. He held several pulpits in the East and Midwest before beginning his long tenure at Temple Sinai of Oakland in 1921. We don't need to say anything else about him, but this article originally appeared in the Menorah magazine in New York in September 1906, so several months after the earthquake. Go for it.
Rehabilitation is the word which is heard in San Francisco on every hand. It sums up the situation completely, and in my description, I shall confine myself as closely as possible to those conditions which are of particular interest to the Jewish world. It should be borne in mind at the outset that there were two distinct losses to the people of San Francisco. The first was an earthquake at 5:15 o'clock in the morning of April 18th. The second was a fire which started shortly after and lasted for about 80 hours. The damage by earthquake is not covered by insurance. Where the loss was sustained through fire, the people are slowly being paid their insurance money.
Okay, do one more paragraph.
Okay. It has already been stated, and quite correctly, that the poor Jewish people suffered severely. The reason is that the fire which succeeded the earthquake took its rise near that quarter of the city where the immigrant Jewish people had their homes. This portion of the city, south of Market Street, was one of the 3 sections where the earthquakes did especial havoc. A large number houses and 7 hotels.
Even, I think it says even hotels.
Oh, and even, sorry, I threw in an S. And even hotels were completely demolished. In many of these buildings, mostly of frame, quite a number of Jews are sure to have perished. It is not known how many. None of the persons with whom I spoke will even give an estimate. 15 bodies have been buried by the Jewish people, only one not being identified. The loss of life was heavier here than in other parts of the city. Before the people had time to recover from the earthquake, the fire was upon them. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a great part of this section was burnt out, and by 10 o'clock, the new synagogue on Russ Street was a pile of ashes.
Okay, so we keep in mind something, that we talked a lot about all of these synagogues and which ones were being built and which ones already had been built. It was all around this time. It was from the 1880s through to the beginning of the 1900s, and then they had a really lovely cadre of synagogues that we'll see that he's listing here. But suddenly, I mean, it's not like these places have been standing for 100 years and something happens. They put all their community's money, all their effort, all their love and desire to build, and then, bam, everything's down. So, just 1 minute, please. Then, south of Market Street. That isn't where all the Jews lived. That is where all the poor Jews lived. So I wanted to make sure it wasn't, you didn't read it as saying, oh, poor Jews, poor us, but rather these were people who were just starting out and lived in that area. Now there's a huge difference. Here. When we talk about New Orleans and the flooding in New Orleans, where the people who got hit and whose homes were destroyed a number of years ago, do you remember that? So that was an area where everybody knew that if something was going to happen, those people would be at risk, because they knew that the water would penetrate there and affect there first. And if you were more wealthy and you lived in another part of New Orleans, you didn't get touched by it. That's not what happened here. Nobody knew where the earthquake was going to hit the most, and nobody knew there were gas pipes and all over the city. So it is completely coincidental in this particular case that the area that was hit was where new people in the community, and particularly poor Jews, were living. So it wasn't because of their socioeconomic status. Yes, I'll repeat what you say. South of Market, it became a landfill area. But at this particular time, they haven't yet excavated in order to create more land in the San Francisco area. So it will be added onto. But this was not a landfill area. However, you're probably correct in that it was closer to where the bay would infiltrate. But I don't think that that's what did the damage in this area. I think initially it was the huge strike of the earthquake, and only then thereafter the fire. So it was particularly difficult in that area because it was the earthquake that hit, that destroyed.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned gas pipes. The gas pipes,
Yes.
did they cause a fire? There was sparks and then,
Bursting of the gas pipes caused
yeah, the fire. Yeah, I would imagine so.
Okay, your turn.
Okay. The fate of the synagogue is peculiarly sad. San Francisco is one of the few cities where a successful effort has been made to unite the various factions among the Orthodox people. Here was a large Orthodox synagogue with an English-speaking minister. Who wrote this? Minister?
Yeah,
That's
what they call them.
yeah.
Yes.
Rabbi Louis G. Reynolds, who had been installed into office about 6 months before. I shouldn't end a sentence that way.
Yeah.
Excellent work was being done, and much was hoped for in the future. 13 scrolls of the law were saved by heroic action, but it was impossible to save the other 7.
I mean, think about that.
So sad.
13 plus 7.
Wow.
This Orthodox synagogue that had just been built
Wow.
had 20 Torahs. Now, I know that this is a factual article, but when I read it, I went, we can find so much more information here. This is one synagogue.
Wow, where'd they get them from?
20
Damn.
Torahs. But what does that mean about what the people had to do to build their community? They didn't just come out of nowhere.
They
People
brought-
gave money to buy them and to bring them over. Or they had relatives who were able to get them in Europe to ship them over. That's a big deal. And suddenly we're saying, okay, they saved 13, but right after they've just created this, after they put their hearts and souls into it, that's what happened. Thank you, Rosalie. Just keep going.
Where am I? Fortunately, the property was insured for $17,000. When the mortgage is paid, this will leave the congregation a sum of $2,000 plus the original piece of property. So the people here are in a fair way to continue religious activity when the members return to San Francisco. No attempt has yet even been made to clear away the debris in this district.
So before Rosalie continues, he's writing at the time, a few months later, right? There's still debris in the street, and yet, what does he say at the end of that paragraph? They've been through all of this, and what's going to happen?
They're going to
They are going to put it back all together.
rebuild. That's
Yeah.
what they're going to do.
Rebuild and get it going. So, I don't know, I just think this is such a great message for all of us, you know, for every community when we go through things. How are we going to react to it? Okay, go on.
The synagogue, which suffered the greatest financial loss but will nevertheless be the least inconvenience, is Temple Emmanuel. It occupied a commanding position on Sutter Street and was one of the old landmarks. 4 years ago, when I returned from the Hawaiian Islands, the 2 gilded peaks of the temple were the first signs of San Francisco to greet my sight. Today, the temple is a total wreck, with every Sefer Torah destroyed. Last year, the temple purchased a new plot of ground with the intention of building in a more quiet part of the city, as the present location was already encompassed by the business section. They purchased a lot on Van Ness Avenue, which since the fire has become the chief business thoroughfare. The plot of ground is leased and brings in a good rental. Since the destruction, Reverend Dr. Jacob, Vorsanger, has been regularly conducting services in the vestry of Calvary Church, but services for the holidays will be held in the Unitarian Church.
Okay, on they go, right? But what does this tell you about the community itself?
Well, they come together, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
They're all helping. Are you all okay? Do you have any questions? Do you have any comments? Did you learn anything new? I mean, one of the things I love about this is that this isn't an article written by an historian that came 100 years later.
What damage it sustained was due to the earthquake, and all proper repairs were quickly made. Since the disaster, the judges of the Supreme Bench have been holding court in the vestry rooms, and the income thus derived will be ample to tide over any financial deficit in the congregation's treasury. Rabbi Jacob Nieto holds regular services each week.
So go back for a minute. How many congregations have we already talked about? Three. Three congregations, and we're getting on to number 4. And this is 1906. How long have they been actually functioning in a city that's more than boards? And so we're talking about 1848 and 49. The city was nothing. It was just, it was a music hall, bar, wood sidewalked city. So we're really not talking about that much time in the period of history in which people build cities. And having been in Rome 3 days ago, we know, how cities develop and how long it takes to actually get things built. It's not like now where you decide to put up a building and, 6 months later, 9 months later, this multi-story building is up. It took a long time. They were hand making things. So let's go to Congregation Ohavei Shalom.
Congregation Ohavei Shalom was likewise injured by the earthquake and quickly repaired. The financial loss suffered by its members will be severely felt, but they are hopeful and expect to continue their congregational activity without any outside aid. Rabbi Bernard M. Kaplan holds regular services and feels that his membership will not suffer as much as the disaster would lead one to expect.
So during this whole thing, you have the soul of the people and the leadership being portrayed to you. So anybody else want to read after Joette? Joette? Okay, come forward, Bridget. Joette's going to do another little bit.
The greatest disaster of all has undoubtedly been to Congregation Beth Israel, of which Rabbi M.S. Levy is the minister. This is a synagogue along conservative lines with a large membership among the middle class of earnest, hardworking, and industrious people. Last year, they decided to move into larger quarters, and the present location was sold to Mr. William Wolfe, who announced to the press throughout the country at the time that he intended to start a free synagogue and Talmudical school. The synagogue was more than half constructed on the day of the earthquake, but is now one mass of heaped up bricks. The contractor is legally entitled to every cent for the work he had finished, and there is not a penny to be obtained through insurance. In round figures, this congregation suffered $68,000 through this earthquake of some 47 seconds in duration. The congregation has a lease for a few months to come into the old building, and this no doubt will be renewed. Rabbi Levy expects to come east in the fall, and if ever a man represented a worthy cause, he will do so.
So he's going to go ask for help on the East Coast. They have already been extremely helpful. Any comments? We're now going to turn to some other different organizations. The reason that we're doing this article together is because the catalog in which it was published is no longer being published. So it's not possible for me to say to you, go out and buy this book on California and Jewish California and earthquakes, because it's not available. So I made the decision that we would share the article together because it has all of this information about what was going on in their community. I hope I hope that's okay. There's no other way to get it to you. So now let's go ahead and turn to the various institutions of San Francisco.
Perhaps the institution about which the people are most anxious to hear is the orphan asylum. Not a single child of the 190 wards suffered in the slightest from the catastrophe. The building of the asylum was badly damaged. The work of repairing has not yet been completed. For 2 nights, the children slept out in the open air, and for the succeeding 5 weeks, gathered in the gymnasium, which was improvised as a dormitory. Not a child was sick during all this time. The record is all the more remarkable when we consider that every other orphan asylum building in San Francisco, Catholic, Protestant, or non-sectarian, was either totally demolished or so badly damaged that the children had to be removed to some neighboring town. Asylum children conducted themselves as heroes and never complained for an instant because of the enforced hardships they had to endure during the week when food was so scarce.
So why do you think that the Jewish orphan community kept the children in town rather than taking them somewhere else? I don't know if it was their gymnasium. Did it say their gymnasium? Okay. That they had some place to go. But so what was said is that they had a gymnasium, so they had some place to put the children. Okay, it's preferable to keep them in town, particularly in the area, because if they send them out somewhere, they may not be able to gather and get them all back. Anybody else have a viewpoint on that? Also, they were kept within the Jewish community. So yes, one more. They wanted to make sure that the children were properly taken care of. I think these are all really important points. But not in this text, but somewhere in one of the other books that I have on Jews in California, it said that they were particularly conscious of the fact that these children were parentless and that what they had was their familiarity with the people that they were taken care of by. That's not good English, but you know what I mean. But also that they were a part of the greater community, as was said. And so those things, despite the problems, would be familiar to them. Whereas yanking a child, even if they go with adults, out of the place that they're familiar with, could be even more problematic emotionally than staying put where they were. Having a mother who was sent on a kinder transport at the age of 14 from where she lived in Vienna to England, I know from her descriptions how even though she was safe and she was well taken care of, what the emotional upheaval is when children are disrupted from where they're used to being. So I just wanted you to take a look at that because I thought that was very kind and careful of the people who made the decisions. Yes. Okay, so now we get to the Home for the Aged, of which there were 2 in San Francisco at that time. And this one is Orthodox. Go on and read.
Okay. The Home for Aged and Disabled Orthodox Hebrews, formerly on Lombard Street, was totally destroyed by fire. The 14 inmates
It's amazing that they call them inmates. I don't know why they do.
The
Yeah.
14 inmates were helpless for the succeeding 5 weeks, during which time they received no special attention, but lived together with the large body of the people in the open air.
Well, stop for 1 minute. This means that they were not taken to some other old age home. They were placed with the other people in the community and became a part of that. I think you all know that they set up things in parks and tents all over the place. So, okay, go on.
The accommodations were obtained for them with the Salvation Army, where they remained 3 weeks. During this time, 2 of the inmates passed away, probably because of the severe ordeals to which they had been subjected. The 12 inmates are now in a temporary home, which has been most excellently provided for them, and their every want is carefully met.
Okay, we won't go on the rest of that paragraph because it's not necessary for what we are learning. But finally, they got taken care of and brought into a situation where they were considerate of their particular needs as very elderly people. I think what we're going to do is kind of just skim the rest of this, and then we're going to go on to another text. I wanted you to get a sense of how much the Jewish community did to make sure that they not only rebuilt, but did so with a positive viewpoint. So why don't you just read the other old people's home thing, and then we'll talk just a little bit to verbalize the rest of it.
The old people's home on Silver Avenue was not severely injured by the earthquake and was in the district not covered by the fire. The damage to its chimneys and water tank was soon repaired. The home tendered its good offices and rendered what assistance it could during the period directly after the earthquake.
So thank you very much. The other organizations that we have that you can see on this article are B'nai B'rith. Most of them lost all of their materials, but some of them were saved. The Benevolent Society, and remember what we said about the Benevolent Society? The Benevolent Society was formed before there were any other such organizations in the area. And then remember, it went on to all the gold rush areas where they formed benevolent societies. And we even read an article about how the Jewish benevolent societies affected everybody else who hadn't yet put together organizations like that. Then there's the Young Man's Hebrew Association. You know what that is, right? The YMHA, like the YMCA. The YMHA existed, and they took in people who were homeless because of the earthquake. The Hebrew Free Loan Association gave assistance to the greatest extent of their capability, and they also went out and fundraised among people in the community who hadn't experienced the same kind of problems. The Zionist organization did what they had to do, which is set aside doing the work for collecting money for the Holy Land, for Israel, which wasn't yet Medinat Yisrael, but they had to set aside that work because they had to work on their own community. That's completely understandable. And then it talks about how other Jewish communities came forward in very distinct ways to help their San Francisco Jewish community. So it says here, as you can well see, that the closest place was Oakland, which brought in food to the San Francisco community, which sent wired money to people in the Jewish community. And it says basically that it was the women, the Jewish women of Oakland and the ladies of Oakland as a whole who made a huge difference in helping the people of San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Oh, Jewish people came to San Francisco as it started to grow and develop. It started to grow and develop mostly because of the gold rush. So then it talks about the fact he put in a paragraph about the fact that that people who were Chinese did a lot of what immigrants did at the time, which is Jewish people lived in particular areas of Oakland and particular areas of San Francisco, and when they got a little bit of money, they moved to a better neighborhood, and then another immigrant group would come in and live in that neighborhood. In San Francisco and in Oakland at that time, the coming in community were the Chinese. But they really suffered because they were new, because they didn't have a communal structure the way people like Jews in the area had. However, we didn't end up doing, because we switched to the gold rush, we didn't end up reading about all the different people who, that we had, we worked our way through certain people, but you need to know that the Jewish community stood up for the Chinese community much more than any other communities in that area did. And I don't know if we read this because it's been a while now, but did we read about the police chief? There was a Jewish police chief in San Francisco who tremendously helped the Chinese community. When people would go in to wreak havoc in the Chinese neighborhood, he put a stop to it. When they had internal fighting, he put a stop to it. He supported and protected them and was the first police chief in that entire community. Well, he was the first Jewish police chief, but he was also the first police chief in that entire community who helped to protect that neighborhood instead. Now, I know I just diverted from the earthquake, so please forgive me. That he was, that he served as the police chief. I don't have my information about him in front of me, but I think it was at the beginning of the 20th century, so not in the 1800s. But I will let you know, Gary, because I have it in my office. So, yeah, Rosalie's talking about Boyle Heights, which was initially a Jewish community, and then when Jews became a little bit more affluent, they moved west, and then the Japanese community moved in, and then after the Japanese community moved out, then it became a Latino community. Cantor Aronoff's father, who grew up in that area, also served as a rabbi and was very interested. He was a rabbi, and he was very interested in the Boyle Heights community, and actually took a huge interest in making sure that the Jewish community would come and support the new Latino community that was moving into the Boyle Heights area. The reason I know this is that there's a picture of him taken with tall, big, Latino guys. I'm not trying to be judgmental, but they looked a little bit more gang-bangy than Rabbi Dubin did. So, but having a wonderful conversation with them. So, yes. So Cecil said that he lived in Brooklyn, and the same thing happened in Brooklyn. When the Jews got a little bit more affluent, they moved to Long Island, and then it became a community of African Americans and Latinos. I think I want to move on. Is it linked to the gold rush, or is it linked to communities? Okay, can we hold on to it for a minute? So in conclusion, this says, one must not think of the people of San Francisco are downcast because of their great misfortune. Nothing is further from the truth. During the days when the rabbis and the physicians and millionaire and clerk all stood in line waiting to receive bread and their provisions, they already spoke most hopefully of the new city. The people are in the best of spirits. And then it goes on and it says that here they are cooking in the streets and no light. And one young man in whose family the dietary laws are observed painted a sign, "Best kosher meals in town," then placed it on the side of the stove, then in the street. So even during those periods of time, people made the best of it and tried to fire up their communities and their possibilities. So I want to we have one more. Can somebody hand out this for the next few minutes? Because I want to have you hear what Levi Strauss had to say, the Gene guy. No, they don't exist any longer. I. Magnin and Joseph Magnin don't exist. Pardon? Okay, so there was I. Magnin all over the place. I know that it existed when I was young, but I don't know what happened after that. Tell me when everybody has this. Okay. So I leave this with you. We'll do a few of these things. But what I want to do first is on the flip page 212. Levi Strauss and Company announce to the trade that they will positively resume business. Can you see it? Yeah. Office and warehouse location now being engaged in Oakland and will be published as soon as particulars can be effected. We hope to soon be in shape to fill current requirements. Fall orders placed with us will be delivered. The firm also wishes to announce that they will continue all salaries of employees until further notice and request them to register names and addresses at their Oakland offices, 10th and Clay Street. So I thought that it was a good thing to let everybody know that that not only did this happen, but there were responses. And if you don't mind me saying this, my father was when he emigrated to China, worked for a Jewish company. In the Far East, a lot of Sephardic Jewish families had businesses all over the Far East and India. And they had this in Shanghai, and he worked for this company, the Sassoon Company. And when the Jews in Shanghai were all interned by the Japanese in a very small area of Shanghai, stuffed into a ghetto, it went on for quite a while, a couple of years. And when the war ended, my father took a whole bunch of people from Sassoon out of the ghetto, and they reclaimed the buildings of the companies that they worked for. However, what happened was the same thing as Levi Strauss did, which is the Sassoon Company said, not only are we grateful for you reestablishing this, but we had every intention of paying you everything we owed from your salaries for the entire time that you were interned. So they did. And this is what Levi Strauss did in a shorter period of time. So one has to hope, we don't know what other companies did this, but we have to hope that it was a question of Jewish values that made these companies that were affluent know that they needed to take care of the people that worked for them in a difficult time. So let's just take a look at one other. These are little vignettes. So you can take a look at it, but I want to have you take a look at the one above Levi Strauss. Dr. Martin Regensberger, president of the State Board of Health, wishes to make it known throughout California that plumbers are needed at once in San Francisco. They must bring their own tools. Their tools will be sufficient credentials to secure them free transportation on any railroad. They are requested to report to the headquarters of the State Board of Health at Laguna and Grove Streets. So what you're seeing are little announcements, but the Regensberger one was important because Dr. Regensberger was a member of the Jewish community and was responsible for trying to bring in people to help do rebuilding in San Francisco. And you'll see on your own that there's something about the YMHA that is willing to open itself up. Let's just take a look at the last part by William Kramer, who, by the way, he wrote wonderful material called the California Jewish Historical Society, and you can still get some of the things if you want to take a look at Jewish history in California. It says artwork was not spared. One of the most important paintings done by San Francisco artist Toby Rosenthal was known as the Cardinal's Portrait. It is from time to time the subject of a tableau at the annual Living Painting Show held in Laguna, California. So it talks about that painting. The painting, interestingly enough, was acquired by Jacob Stern, a nephew of Levi Strauss, the man that made the pants that won the West. And the painting was saved during the 1906 fire. And then it talks about the different things with regard to the artist and how they tried to restore things. And then they hit the Oakland Museum when the artwork that was harmed in the earthquake could be restored. They sent it to the Oakland Museum and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and that's where they restored these pieces of art that were destroyed or partially destroyed during the earthquake. One of the things that we read about at the very beginning on that day when we were having trouble with the Zoom calls and screens was about, I think it was about Stern, who owned an incredible library of books, all of which were destroyed in the earthquake, and that happened in a number of different situations. Happens, but the Jewish community recouped, rebuilt, and stayed strong. And that's what we always do. So we are out of time. If you would like to have any information individually about the Jewish pioneer women that I was going to talk about, I'm sure Susie would be willing to send it out to you. What would you like to say?
So I'd like to thank you for your historical perspective of the Jewish community during the gold rush and up in San Francisco and down yonder also. We really enjoyed it, and we're an educated group here, and we love history, and we love to learn about Judaica and anything that surrounds the Jewish community, no matter where they live, in the world, in California, etc.
Yeah, you just did the whole world.
In the whole world, so we're
yeah.
thankful. Yeah, history of us now, so even here at Adada Riel. That's right. So Rabbi, we look forward to seeing you next year again.
What do you want to learn next year?
I don't know, but
We'll
I'm
have to
sure
talk
you'll
about
be
it.
creative and come up with a topic. Rabbi Goodman's continuing with the diaspora because we only got to Hungary. We got a lot more to do.
A lot more left to go.
So maybe.
So, I'm gonna just finish by telling you about two women. One is Mary Goldsmith Prague, who was the first member of the San Francisco Board of Education. She was born in 1846, and she came to the United States. But she, who was very involved in the Jewish community and the community as a whole, was the mother of Florence Prague Kahn, who graduated from the University of California in 1887. One of a handful of women who was able to do that. She had a husband who was a congressman, and when he died, she succeeded him as a congressperson and won re-election 5 times as a congressperson out of San Francisco. And she became the first woman to serve on the Military Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C. And so, just so that you know about some of the people we didn't do, these were people who were born in California or came to California exactly during this period of time, and the things that they were able to achieve were outstanding. But the things that women were able to achieve also happened because the West was more open. Because it was pioneering, it was more open to women's participation. So the UC system admitted women much earlier than most other university systems did. There were actually, I think that there were actually 7 women in her class at the University of California. They say only 1 of 7, but I think that there were only 40 or 50 people in a class, so that ain't bad for that period of time. So keep taking a look at California Jewish history. It's fascinating. We only just scratched surface, but there's so much to learn and so much to be proud of that we've achieved. And I really want to thank you. And I have no idea what we're studying next year, but whatever it is, it'll be fun, I hope.
That's early Adada Riel history.
I think I have it here. No, give this to her. Give this to her.
Not that.
No, I'm returning these. These were extra. Here's a whole set for
I can't tell you how
how much I enjoyed her.
Why are you turning it on? Why don't you give it to her? Oh, her. Well, here.
I need to. And this one too.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to tell you.
Girls, we're going with taking
Yes.
Ray home now.
Yes.
What? I didn't hear.
Okay.
Gonna walk out. Fabulous. I love it. That was lovely. I wanted to show it to my husband, but I didn't.
I think she went to the restroom.
That's my son. Taking it off the wall. On the wall.
I have a copy.
Okay, bye.
How are you?
I brought some. Big talking at one point about the when college there eating that actually brought home. After my how long do I have to wait? So he made getting the lady did. Brought it for show and tell. I have a stand. Yes,
All right.
this was a great subject. It's certainly things that people.
And
No, I'm sure not.